Edson Arantes de Nascimento, better known as Pele, has died at the age of 82. Universally regarded as one of the greatest footballers of all time, Pele's death comes at the end of a year, which marked the 60th anniversary of him winning his second World Cup at the age of only 21. 8 years later, despite vowing following the 1966 World Cup in England that he would never play at the World Cup again, Pele was once again Brazil's starman in Mexico, where he won a third FIFA World Cup. More than 50 years on, he remains the only man to have won the World Cup 3 times. Pele was not only immensely talented and a global icon, he also redefined the sport and ensured, even from the age of 17, when he won his first World Cup, that football would never be the same again. In debates around the greatest footballers of all time, which have intensified in recent years, people often begin by saying, "I never saw Pele," to explain why he didn't feature in their thinking. That is fairly reasonable, in some respects, but whilst they may never have seen Pele in the flesh, they have seen him every time they have ever watched someone juggle a ball to beat a man, every time they witness a forward feinting to shoot whilst actually dummying the ball and rounding the goalkeeper, and every time they see someone performing a Cruyff turn, a move which Pele perfected more than a decade before Johan Cruyff used it, most famously to embarrass Jan Olsen at the 1974 World Cup, hence its name. Of course, Pele didn't invent all of those skills, and he had inspirations growing up all of his own, but no one had previously played association football with such skill, ingenuity, athleticism and joy as a teenage Pele did up to that point, and arguably no one has since, which saw Pele almost immediately be heralded, not just as the greatest footballer of all time, but also as the most revolutionary and influential. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote in his central work, The World as Will and Representation, that the man of talent is like a marksman who hits a mark that others cannot hit. The man of genius is like a marksman who hits a mark that they cannot even see to. By that measure, Pele was undeniably a genius. He was to football what Galileo was to astrophysics, Darwin to biology, and Hendrix to the guitar. Pele took a field that was long established and did things that other players had never even imagined doing, let alone doing several of them flawlessly, time and time again, against the best players of his generation and some of the greatest of all time. Following the death of an icon like Pele, thousands of obituaries will be written and millions of tributes paid. Many of them will have been drafted years before he even died. I have made several videos on this channel about Pele in the past, particularly to push back against some of the silliest revisionism that is made about his talents and achievements, but in light of his passing, I wanted to take a closer look at the life of Pele and exactly what made him so special. I, like most of you watching this video I would imagine, grew up viewing Brazil as international footballing powerhouses. At the first World Cup that I can remember, Brazil won their 5th World Cup, making them world football's most successful team, and players like Ronaldo, Rivaldo, and Ronaldinho were seen as encapsulating the joy and genius of the beautiful game. I can still remember going round to a friend's house as a child who had a poster of Ronaldinho next to their television, and his dad would only half-jokingly insist on him bowing to the buck-toothed Brazilian every time he walked past him. It was often said at the time, and indeed it still sometimes is, that whilst the British may have invented and codified football, it was the Brazilians who perfected it. It is all too easy to forget then, nowadays, for people of my generation and even those of my parents, that when Pele went to his first World Cup in 1958, at the age of 17, Brazil had never won the World Cup. They had come extremely close on home soil in 1950, requiring only a draw in the de facto final between themselves and Uruguay, at the home of Brazilian football, the Maracanã, in front of the largest crowd ever assembled, for a game of football, and in which they were the big favourites. The plucky Uruguayans, competing in only their first World Cup since emerging victorious, in their own home tournament 20 years earlier though, had a different idea of how that particular script should be written. After going 1-0 down at the start of the second half, they fought back, in front of only a few thousand Uruguayans out of almost 200,000 in the crowd, to win their game 2-0, and with it, their second World Cup. Witnessing that heartbreak, known as the Maracanazo in Brazil and considered to be a national tragedy, which sparked both riots and grief in equal measure at the time, Pele's father was supposedly moved to tears. Seeing his father's pain, more so than the nation's at that time, a 9-year-old Pele allegedly promised him that he would one day win Brazil the World Cup. Were it not for a devastating knee injury, Pele's own father could well have been playing for Brazil at that World Cup. Full name João Ramos de Nascimento, just like his son, Pele's father had a shorter and more memorable nickname that he was more commonly known by, namely Dondinho. A tremendous athlete who was particularly celebrated for his enormous leap and heading ability, Dondinho was a sensation at state level, and he famously scored 5 goals in the final of the Itajubens Amateur Football Championship, having played youth team football for Minas Gerais' biggest club, Atlético Mineiro. Dondinho returned to Atlético Mineiro at the age of 22, and he later spent 4 years, in 2 separate stints, playing for Fluminense. But it was an injury that he sustained to his knee in 1940 as a 23-year-old that dashed Dondinho's hopes of becoming a starman at the very highest level. He continued playing football into his mid-30s, legend has it, once scoring 5 goals with his head in a single game, a rare feat which Pele long sought but failed to replicate. But with money hard to come by as Dondinho worked as a milkman alongside playing football, Pele grew up in poverty. From the age of 7, he supplemented his family's income by working as a shoeshine boy in his home state, just as Jose Andrade, arguably the greatest South American footballer before Pele, had done in Uruguay as a child as well. If Dondinho could be forgiven for thinking that his 9-year-old son was being a little bit fanciful or naive when he promised him that he would win Brazil their first World Cup, then the idea that he would do it at either of the next 2 World Cups could surely be dismissed as being absurd. And yet, in 1982, legendary Sao Paulo boss Vincenzo Viola named 17-year-old Pele in his squad. In doing so, he made Pele the youngest player to have ever gone to the FIFA World Cup. What was perhaps even more extraordinary, though, was the fact that Pele was injured at the time, and Viola knew that he wouldn't be available for either of Brazil's opening 2 games. Nonetheless, his inclusion, while surprising by virtue solely of his age and injury status, was not without merit. Pele had scored on his debut for Santos as a 15-year-old, shortly after signing a professional contract with the club, and the following season, at 16, he scored 41 goals in 38 games. In the 1958 season as a whole, Pele scored 66 goals in 46 games for Santos and 9 goals in 7 games for Brazil. His combined total of 75 goals as a tally for the calendar year was actually the best of his career, and one which wouldn't be beaten until Gerd Muller bagged 85 goals in 1972. Not half bad for a 17-year-old then. Although Brazil's World Cup campaign got off to a decent start, with victory against Austria followed by a draw with England, senior members of the Brazil squad convinced Vicente Viola to start both Garrincha and Pele in Brazil's final group game against the Soviet Union. Viola was right to heed their calls, as whilst neither of them scored, both put in attacking masterclasses and turn providers for Vava, as Brazil won the game 2-0. They retained their starting berths in the quarter-finals, where Pele scored the only goal of the game against an excellent Wales team. Then came the semi-final, in which Pele scored a stunning hat-trick, still the youngest player ever to do so at a World Cup, against a formidable France team, and in the final, against the host nation Sweden, Pele bagged a brace, taking his tournament total up to 6 goals from 4 games, as Brazil won 5-2 to claim their first World Cup and make good on Pele's promise to his father, way ahead of schedule. The World Cup is the tournament with which Pele is most synonymous, his distinction of having won world football's biggest prize more times than any other player, often being seen as the ultimate mark of his greatness. But during his actual career, and for Pele himself, his relationship with the World Cup was immensely complicated from 1958 onwards. At the 1962 World Cup, which came when Pele was at just about the peak of his powers as a 21-year-old, he assisted the first goal and scored the second in a 2-0 win against Mexico in Brazil's opening game. But in Brazil's second match, against Czechoslovakia, Pele picked up an injury which ruled him out for the rest of the tournament. He was replaced by Amarildo in arguably the best side that Brazil have ever assembled, but it was Garrincha who stepped up to the plate in Pele's absence, ensuring that the Seleção won a second successive World Cup. If success at the 1962 World Cup felt hollow for Pele, then failure in 1966 would feel like an injustice. Pele was injured after scoring a free kick in Brazil's opening game once again, this time against Bulgaria, having been on the receiving end of several fouls at a tournament that was marred by vicious tackles. He returned, though still injured, for Brazil's final group game against Portugal, which was a must-win for the Seleção, following defeat to Hungary without him. Pele was once again on the receiving end of a series of tackles seemingly designed to cause maximum damage, with little action taken by the referees, and he was forced to limp off as the 10 men of Brazil lost to Portugal's Eusebio in the days before substitutions and were knocked out of the World Cup. Such was the outrage, not just from Pele but felt throughout South America following the World Cup in England and the officiating at the tournament, that Pele swore that he would never play at the World Cup again. He broke that promise 4 years later in Mexico on the request of Brazil manager and former teammate Mario Zagallo and around 100 million Brazilians at the time in truth. Though he was still only 29 years old, Pele was already past his absolute best by 1970, which was his lowest scoring season at club level for Santos, but nonetheless, in a star-studded Brazil squad, at the first World Cup to be broadcast worldwide in colour, Pele remained the star. There were to be no injuries this time around, just 4 goals, 5 assists, and a third FIFA World Cup crown for the greatest player of all time. This was to be Pele's last World Cup, and everyone knew it, and the boy from Minas Gerais chose to mark his promise to his father from exactly 2 decades ago with an exclamation mark. At club level, Pele put on more shows than BB King throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s. In 1961, a couple of Italian clubs had offered to more than double the existing world record transfer fee to sign Pele from Santos for $1 million. But Brazilian president João Quadros declared him a non-exportable national treasure, which prevented Pele from ever leaving Brazil, supposing that he had ever wanted to, and there is little evidence to suggest that he ever did. It's often pointed out that Pele didn't play in Europe, as though it was some kind of black mark against him, when, in actual fact, virtually no leading South American players played in Europe during Pele's peak years. At the 1958, 1962, 1966 and 1970 World Cups, every member of all 4 of those Brazil squads played their club football in Brazil, and they won 3 of them. The standard, even in the Campeonato Paulista and the Torneo Rio Sao Paulo, whilst these things are extremely difficult to measure, was probably as good, if not better, than almost any standard in Europe at the time, and certainly Santos were the best club side in the world throughout almost all of the 1960s. It is important to note that Santos were a big but far from successful provincial football club at state level when Pele broke into the first team, having only won the state championship once prior to 1955. With Pele in their ranks though, along with a whole crop of talented youngsters, Santos soon won all that there was to win in Sao Paulo and Brazil, including consecutive Campeonato Brasileiro, Copa Libertadores, and Intercontinental Cup crowns. At that point, and once again, thanks primarily to the global appeal of Pele, Santos realised that it was far more profitable for them to play games outside of Brazil, touring relentlessly for the next decade and staging hundreds, if not thousands of exhibition games, which Pele was contractually obliged to play in. It is possible, and indeed quite probable one would think, that the insane demands put on Pele and the non-stop schedule that he was subjected to at Santos, combined with some notoriously barbaric challenges on him, contributed to his injuries at World Cups and to him having begun to decline physically at least before turning 30. Nonetheless, it was an arrangement that, albeit extremely intense, did actually suit Pele in most respects. A magnificent footballer, but for a considerable amount of time, perhaps not the shrewdest of businessmen, Pele twice lost almost his entire fortune, and in addition to paying him a fortune, Santos were willing on more than one occasion to pick up the tab for Pele to keep their star attraction content. It was for a similar reason that, just a few months after leaving Santos and retiring from football, Pele made an unexpected return in the United States of all places, having been offered a 3-year deal worth $7 million by the New York Cosmos, which made him the highest paid athlete in the world. Pele had effectively gone from playing unofficial exhibition games for Santos, largely touring around Europe, to official exhibition games in the United States, almost like Elvis taking up a residency in Las Vegas, where he still dazzled and filled stadiums, albeit as a tribute act of his former self. At his best, it was a confluence of attributes that made Pele so joyous to watch and devastating to play against. He was lightning quick, capable of running the 100 meters in just 11 seconds. He was built like a bullet, so strong and near enough impossible to knock off his track. He had superb movement and understanding of the game, seemingly limitless flair, skill and invention, fantastic close control. He was almost as creative as he was clinical, typically occupying the spaces of a number 10, more so than a number 9, in possession of a tremendous leap and heading ability, in addition to a powerful and accurate shot with either foot. Combine all of that with near flawless decision making, that all too rare but crucial ingredient that separates the very good players from the truly great ones, and you end up with the most complete forward ever to have played the game, who could ride vicious and brutal tackles at times, wrestle with the meanest of defenders and come out on top, and humiliate even the most competent of them at the peak of their powers. One of the most remarkable things about Pele is that his global reputation as once the undisputed, and now merely one of the 3 or 4 greatest players of all time, was built despite most people having seen very little, if anything at all, of him during his peak years, at a time before every second of every football match was broadcast in 4K Ultra HD around the entire world. Pele is best remembered, and the footage that most people have seen of him, by virtue of it being the World Cup, is of his performances at the 1958 and 1970 World Cups, aged 17 and 29 respectively. But Pele was at his absolute best for the tournaments in 1962 and in 1966, where he got injured on both occasions in Brazil's opening games. Without those injuries, or just if more of Pele's peak years had been televised or just recognised, it is quite possible that that debate would still remain settled. Pele's death, to me personally, feels like the death of his era of football within the global conscience or psyche, and the first person that I thought of when I saw that he had died was my granddad. My granddad was quick to condemn and slow to praise, in a manner typical of a certain type of Englishman of his generation, and there were only a handful of footballers who left a lasting impression in his mind. He heaped praise upon Paul Scholes, he was in awe of George Best, and he ran out of superlatives for that most majestic of Englishmen, Rach Carter. But it was the great Pele who was elevated beyond the status of mere footballer and into the realm of social and cultural phenomenon reserved solely for athletes like Muhammad Ali and epoch-defining world leaders who stood out head and shoulders above all the rest. Pele's death, in that regard then, feels to me a little bit like the feeling that some people experienced early this year, even if they were Republicans, towards the death of the Queen, in the sense that, regardless of their feelings about her as a person or the role that she occupied, her death felt like the loss of a cultural link and emotional connection to a bygone era. In the case of the Queen, that was the so-called silent generation, World War II, and 1950s Britain. In the case of Pele, it is football and possibly even more than football, I think, before the 1950s, and the whole generation of players that formed his peers and his predecessors. There was a fantastic video shared 1 or 2 years ago showing great pieces of skill that are synonymous with some of the greatest players of all time, whether that be Cruyff, Messi, the Brazilian or Portuguese Ronaldos, Ronaldinho, Maradona or Zidane, followed by Pele doing the exact same thing at least a decade and in most cases, many decades before them. It had a faint ring of that famous South Park episode, and some of you will just have to trust me on this, where Butters dreams up a series of schemes to take over the world, but realizes that they have all already been performed on The Simpsons, and then he starts to hear people telling him that The Simpsons did it, ringing over and over in his ears. And that, effectively, is what it is like for every footballer to have followed in the footsteps of Pele. There was virtually nothing that they could do within the game that Pele hadn't already done. That is not to say that he is still the best footballer of all time, that's another discussion for another time. But in terms of footballing greatness, in the true essence of what that word means, combining talent, influence, and the sheer emotional response that they conjure up in all those who watch them play, Pele remains a man without peer, the undisputed king of football. Like so many of the skills that he performed, Pele most likely didn't actually invent the phrase, "Oh, yoga bonito," which translates to the beautiful game. But he certainly popularized it, and he did more to encapsulate the spirit of it every time he crossed that white line than anyone else in the history of the game. That is it for today's video. I could go on for ages. There are 11 more paragraphs in my notes, but it is actually 5 a.m. and I started this at 7 p.m. when I found out the news about Pele. So, yeah, I'm basically a wreck. But like this video if you enjoyed it. Leave a comment if you have anything that you would like to, comment. And feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on social media, on either Twitter or Instagram, via the username @HITC Sevens, should you wish to do so.